Thank you, Scott. Thank you for inviting me to be here. Thank you to everybody who's here. Lots of dear old faces and dear new ones as well. We're going to talk about Ubud and foreigners. Ubud's long and questionable romance with tourists. But before we get going, I just want us all to think for a moment about what tourism is, actually, and what tourists are. In the anthropology of tourism, they talk about hosts and guests. And these guests, in fact, travel voluntarily at their own expense to another person's country, another people's country, in order to see what's there. Why? Why does this appeal so deeply to everyone? What is it in the human being that wants to go and be away from home in somebody else's home? Anyway, we'll talk about Bali. Tourism to Bali began really in the violence of the Puputan Bali, the massacres that took place in 1906 and 1908 by several royal courts in the south of Bali into the artillery of the Dutch colonial forces. The world was astonished, and in response, Holland decided that it would open its territories, its colonies, to tourism. Only 8 years later, in 1914, Bali welcomed its first tourists. I think there were about 8. Tourism for the Dutch was a way for them to show the benign face of their colonial policies. Here we see a benign soldier with children. In Ubud, the story begins with Jean Couteau Sukawati of Puri Ubud. Now this was a very powerful man, but he was not a king. Ubud was under Pliatan, which was under Gianyar, which had ties to Sukawati. So he wasn't a king. But he could have been called a warlord. In 1893, he conquered most of the region of Gianyar, and they owed their land to him and their loyalty to him. So Ubud became very rich around the turn of the 20th century. Now this Jean Couteau Sukawati had 2 very influential sons. Jean Couteau Raka Sukawati and Jean Couteau Agung Sukawati. And oddly enough, tourism to Ubud begins in Java, when Jean Couteau Sukawati, Raka Sukawati, was at the palace of the Sultan of Jogja, where he happened to meet the German painter and composer Walter Spies, who looked after the orchestra for the Sultan. And they were very taken with each other, and Jean Couteau Raka invited Walter Spies to come to Ubud and live on his land. So in 1927, Walter Spies moved to Champuan and built a house on land given to him by Jean Couteau Raka Sukawati. Now, Jean Couteau Raka Sukawati was a politician, and he spent most of his time in Jakarta. Back home at Puri Ubud was Jean Couteau Agung Sukawati, and he loved entertaining foreign visitors. And to give you an example of this, I jump ahead for a moment and show you this picture of him accompanying Robert F. Kennedy and his wife in Bali in 1962. Back in the 1930s, Walter Spies blossomed in Ubud. He fell in love with Bali and everything about it, and he became very knowledgeable about all things Balinese, especially the culture. And he was a magnet to other people who were interested in Bali as well. Everyone said, "Go see Walter Spies." One of the most impressive of his friends was the Mexican painter Miguel Covarrubias. He was an illustrator, a caricaturist, and an amateur ethnographer. And he happened to write The Island of Bali, which is still, I think, the most definitive ethnography of Bali. Even how many years later? It was published in 1937. Now, as a Mexican ethnographer, Covarrubias also happened to be a co-discoverer of the Olmec civilization in Mexico. And here's a caricature he made of himself as an Olmec for your entertainment. Now, Covarrubias and many other people were inspired to come to Bali because of seeing the photographs of Gregor Krause, a German photographer who was actually a doctor here with the colonial Dutch in 1912. And he published a double volume album of photographs, mostly of the beauty of the Balinese people. And very many of those were of the beauty of Balinese women bathing. So very early, Bali had an image of being a place that was exotic. Now let's look a little at early tourism in Bali. Tourism was very controlled by the Dutch. They didn't allow their tourists to stay overnight in the villages, but they could stay only at designated places. Eventually they built the Bali Hotel in Denpasar, and that's where most people stayed. You will have heard perhaps of two other hotels in Kuta at the time. Bali's early tourists were amazed by Bali's ritual arts. Excuse me. This is a painting of Covarrubias of the scene that happens before the performance of a temple drama. And it was striking to Westerners that temple art, which was supposed to be religious art, could be so funny and so popular. They were fascinated by Rangda, and they referred to her as the witch. And many people had an idea of the Balinese image of the female as dual. It was either the witch or a virgin. They were very excited about the danger and the magic in ritual drama. And of course, they were fascinated by trance. This is the Denjalan Batu Bulan group performing in the 1930s. The descendants of these people are still performing. Normally, this ceremony of the ritual attack on Rangda, which ends up in trance stabbing, was performed late at night after midnight. But the Balinese consented to do it in the daylight so it could be photographed. One of the early examples of how nice the Balinese are about everything. And Westerners were fascinated by the Balinese way of encountering death, which was frank, cheerful, very complex, and public, utterly unlike the West. In the 1920s, they were already promoting cremations in Bali. If one of the palaces was having a big cremation, then the Dutch authorities would send word to the official tourist office in Surabaya so that they could arrange for visitors to come and watch. As for painting and sculpture, traditional artisans were beginning to make a new secular kind of art, about daily life. Beforehand, they were making mostly art for the temples. Now this influence was coming from two foreigners, Walter Spies and the Dutch painter Rudolf Bonnet. This is some of the Balinese painting that we've come to know, very difficult to look at without a lot of time. Walter Spies and Rudolf Bonnet joined with Chokoda Agung Sukawati of Ubud and the artist I Gusti Nyoman who we'll come to in a moment, to form the Peter Maha Artists Association, which is very well known in Ubud and very little known outside Ubud. Now the idea here is very paternalistic in a way. They wanted to improve and maintain the quality of Balinese art by weekly inspections, and they wanted to promote the selling of high-quality art by organizing sales exhibitions outside Bali. So these two foreigners and a prince undertook this. It was interrupted by World War II. This is a picture of Rudolf Bonnet reading the paper in his garden in Ubud in the 1950s. Now, you must have all heard of Gusti Nyoman Lempad. This artist, this very long-lived artist, was really the star of his epic. He was born in Bedulu, not in Ubud, and his father, who was a traditional artist and undagi, had some intrigue in Bedulu, and he heard that his life was in danger. So he and his son, who was about 9 at the time, moved from Bedulu to Ubud and sought refuge with the palace. Lempad also thrived in Ubud. Both of them had lots of work as Ubud star was rising. There were plenty of barongs and temples to be made, and Lempad became renowned as an undagi himself. He found a lifelong patron with Puri Ubud. And this gate that you see here is his design. Much of the Ubud that we see today, according to the film Lempad of Bali, is of Lempad's design. Much of the old stuff, that is, of course. Now, among Westerners, Lempad was most famous for his line drawings, which were original and beautiful and showed terrific imagination. This is a battle scene from the Ramayana. And if you can see, there's so much despair in the faces. It's an unusual way to paint a battle. Lempad produced drawings on commission from foreigners, and sometimes erotic drawings, so don't look too closely at that one. Bagus Nyana was the most renowned woodcarver of that period. He was a very gifted sculptor indeed. These are two of his works that show how wide his imagination was. Nyana had a son called Tilim, who was also a carver, and who built a very successful gallery and woodcarving studio in Mas, where they were from. And this is Puri Lukisan, which is famous these days for its parking lot. But actually, it's a monument to the importance of art in Ubud in the 20th century. It houses the Peter Maha collection, most of which was donated by Rudolf Bonnet. And it was built very much on the urging of Rudolf Bonnet. He was very devoted to art in Bali, this Dutchman. And in fact, when he died in Holland, but his ashes were brought to Bali to be given a ceremony with the cremation of Chokoda Agung Sukawati in 1978. Bali's fame and its reputation as an exotic place was certainly due also to the films that were made here. Two of the feature films are Guna Guna, released in 1932, and Legong Dance of the Virgins from 1935. And this was the last film, silent film, that Hollywood ever produced. And then we come to the dark period from the 1940s to the 1960s. World War II, the Indonesian Revolution, famine from rice plagues and the eruption of Gunung Agung, and the mass murder of tens of thousands, many tens of thousands of suspected communists. All this discouraged tourism to Bali. And yet, by 1968, the airport was extended to take international jetliners. Now, what was happening? In the 1960s, international tourism was seen as a solution for newly independent developing nations. It was a way for them to get foreign direct investment. It facilitated international relations and the transfer of technology. And it was thought to be less disruptive than mining. So when the authorities in Bali heard that they were going to have tourism, they got together and they decided that they would have cultural tourism. Now this book is quite pivotal among anthropologists, written by the French sociologist Michel Picard. It's called Bali, Cultural Tourism and Touristic Culture. And he discusses this process that Bali went through at quite some length. And he points out that when the cultural authorities, when the Balinese opinion leaders, he calls them, were thinking about how to manage cultural tourism in Bali, they had to borrow words like sacred and profane in order to even discuss this. These concepts weren't known in Bali. And so, here's a sacred dance from, I think, East Bali, somewhere, a Rejang. So the Balinese authorities came up with Balinese terms for sacred, semi-sacred, and profane. And that way people could work out what sort of dance could be performed for tourists and what could only be performed as a religious rite. Now, what exactly were they trying to protect? We'll think about Balinese culture for a moment. I propose that Balinese culture is about visibly honoring the invisible world with the intention to turn chaos into harmony or demons into gods. And the technique for doing this is ritual, through offerings. And if you want to check the theology of this, it's in the Kala Tatua Lontar. I'm told, I haven't read it personally, in which Kala, the son of Shiva and Uma, is appointed to be god of the demons. But his nature is not only negative, it's positive as well. And his father tells him, with the proper offerings, you can change form from demonic to a form of peace. And all your armies will become gods and goddesses, and you will return to be at one with your mother and father in heaven. The ritual, as you would have seen, is the backbone of Balinese society. And it's a part of daily life. This is a palancan, which is set up in every house and shop. for daily offerings. And Balinese culture is highly ordered. Ritual ceremonies take place according to the calendar. Now, there's the lunar calendar, where they observe the dark of the moon and the full moon, and then there's the 210-day Pawukon calendar, which is terribly complicated, comprised of 10 cycles of days. If you can make out how tiny the writing is, you can imagine how hard it is to figure it out. Society itself is very strictly ordered. The base of it is the banjar, or the neighborhood community. And its rules are law, even today. It enforces social conventions and ritual obligations, and it deals with legal matters such as birth, marriage, death, and land ownership. Membership is obligatory for all married couples in the neighborhood. And the banjar will meet usually once every 35 days on a day of its choosing. And if you don't go there, you have to pay a fine. It's very strict. But there's great variety in the style of architecture. Excuse me. At the top, you see a Bali Banjar in Tenganan, and below that is the Bali Banjar of Ubud Claude, as extravagant as money will buy. Temple festival worship is communal and felt to be obligatory. Ritual protocol is strict, but with almost no dogma, because this is a performative religion, and it's expressed in devotional work and ritual arts such as music, dance, theater, and the transient art of offerings. In Bali, conformity is a virtue, a reflection of an orderly world. So ideally, society would reflect the divine order. Now this all raises the question, with such a rigidly ordered life, how do the Balinese grow up to be so self-confident and charming? It's probably because they are treated as deities as children. A baby is considered a reincarnated ancestor and is treated with the same reverence as the gods. Now there's something to think about. When you grow up in a very strictly governed society, it's hard to understand the personal freedom that's envied by Westerners. So again, it shows you how tolerant the Balinese are. So it's people and nature that make Bali such a magical place to live. And we must remember that for most of the 20th century, Bali was still a very low-tech society. Electricity and paved roads and motorcycles didn't really come to Ubud until the 1970s and 80s. So daily life was very close to nature, very big in daily life. And actually, even foreigners could believe in an invisible world in those days. Now, how do you market all this? And what happens when you try to? Ubud, having no beach, must offer its culture as its tourism product. Now, the homestay was a brilliant innovation. All the villagers were asked to build a little accommodation in their backyards, behind their houses. And when their tourists came, they made friends with their local family and learned about the way of life. This is quite a change from the Dutch, and it brought some income to the local people. Another measure was to revise traditional dances and make them suitable for the comfort and attention span of tourists. So they were shorter, and there were chairs, and they took place before dinner, and became what Michel Picard calls touristic culture. And these dances are still enrolled by the national government for events like the annual meeting of a political party, or for the opening of the Bali Arts Festival, or any other sort of national event. Traditional crafts became souvenirs, mostly wood carving, painting, and jewelry. And the good part about this was that people were allowed to work from home. So you didn't have a mass exodus of people to the city to find work. Tourists were encouraged to visit painters in their home studios. Tourists were welcome at local events, especially cremations. So we've talked about cremations coming as early as the 1920s were already a tourist event. But that's for the prestige of the cremating palace. And Ubud also serves as a hub for people who want to visit the rest of the island. It's a center of tours, and it used to be a center for anthropologists, very convenient. Then, as the world economy expanded, Bali went upmarket. In Ubud, this was apparent in many new enterprises. We'll mention two. There was the auspicious opening of the Café Lotus in the mid-1980s, and then there was the opening of the Amandari in 1989. Homestays became villas in the family rice fields. And the relationship between host and guest became more purely commercial. Yoga and meditation became popular in Ubud. And the folklore behind the marketing of that is Ubud means ubad in Balinese, and obat in Indonesian, and medicine in English. So Ubud, center of healing. Spas appeared everywhere. And this was part of the movement to indulge yourself in ... Then there was specially designed tours for water blessing from a priest or a healer, and there are now ever more experiences on offer. This is a day tour in Ubud 2024. You can have your picture taken on a swing, or on an elephant, or in the most famous gateway in Bali, for which people line up at dawn. We are now in the era of post-cultural tourism. The emerging market is not culture, but property, being pushed on Facebook. These are all projects to be built and rented out. Hidden City is famous now. I've put in the promotional text a bit because it promises diverse cafes and restaurants, shopping centers, co-working spaces, and a beach club. This speaks for itself, I think. Now we'll just look for a moment at the impacts of tourism. Of course, there are economic impacts. That was the idea. It seems that there's a vast amount of money pouring into Bali. This is a good thing for the Balinese in many ways because it's raised the standard of living. But not all the profits stay in Bali, and there are questions about where some of the money is coming from. Also, there's a tendency among some Balinese to think that anything new that makes money must be good. And this leads to a lack of critical thinking about development policy. The environmental impacts are mostly problems of carrying capacity. There's a danger in giving priority, water priority, to hotels and villas, in that local people may come to resent tourists. This hasn't happened yet, but it's happening in Koh Samui in Thailand, I believe. Deforestation and overbuilding are often symbols or symptoms of corruption, and trash is just bad advertising for a destination. Now, my conclusion is that it's not the culture that's threatened. Ritual is perfectly safe, and many people aren't even interested in it. It's the environment, and therefore Bali's economy. Because with the ruining of the environment, they will lose what's attracted people in the first place. Now, these problems will ultimately need to be solved by the government, and so the solution must come from an educated public. But there are things that we can discuss in the meantime. So I propose two questions. Is there a role for foreigners in Balinese society? And are there economic alternatives to tourism in Ubud? And with that, we'll shut down here.